We gather today to turn our Constitution's promise of equality and dignity into a lived reality for all. So at the outset, let us confront some harsh realities. Nearly 30 years after democracy, South Africa remains one of the most unequal societies on earth. Unemployment is staggeringly high. Roughly 1 in 3 adults is jobless, and nearly half of young people cannot find work. Millions live in poverty. So you see, these just aren't statistics. They reflect the daily lived reality of young graduates unable to find jobs and of families who are struggling to put food on the table. And we see this. We see the frustration of a generation with much to offer, but simply no chance to participate. Last week we celebrated Mandela Day, and Nelson Mandela quite eloquently reminds us that overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity, it is an act of justice. So the trajectory that we're on simply cannot continue. I put it to you, is this the inclusive prosperity that we envisaged in 1994? Is this what we hoped for? Clearly not. But we are not here today to lose hope. We are here to chart a path forward. So we must then examine our legal landscape and ask ourselves whether our laws are healing the wounds of the past or whether those same laws are simply creating new wounds. South Africa's constitution then becomes our lodestar, enshrining non-racialism, human dignity, the achievement of equality, and the advancement of human rights and freedoms as founding values of the Republic. Section 9 of the Bill of Rights guarantees equality and even goes so far as to permit, to allow affirmative action measures under Section 9.2 to advance those who have been disadvantaged by unfair discrimination. Thus, what that means in practice is that the government may make laws that discriminate against South Africans based on their race to achieve equality, to achieve substantive equality. That is a South Africa where everyone fully and equally enjoys all rights and freedoms. But importantly, the Constitutional Court, in the case of the Minister of Justice versus Van Heerden, has held that for such redress measures to be presumed to be fair, they must then meet certain key requirements. If not, they are not fair. And these 3 requirements are, first, they must target a genuinely disadvantaged group. Listen carefully. First, they must target a disadvantaged group. Secondly, they must be reasonably designed to protect or uplift that group. And third, they should not impose such substantial undue harm on those who are then excluded from its benefits. That eventually is South Africa's long-term goal of a constitutional republic, one where non-racialism and non-sexism exist as founding values. In other words, affirmative action policies should be a bridge to a future of equality. They should not perpetuate new forms of inequality. But the Constitution, with its founding value of non-racialism, clearly never intended affirmative action to become this perpetual racial entitlement that we see today. Because this would then threaten that goal that the Constitution wants of a non-racial society. Surely, ladies and gentlemen, the sun must eventually set. We must always keep in front of our mind that the ultimate goal, as Justice Ngobo noted, is a racial non-sexist society where each person's worth is equal. Thus, any policy that undermines that long-term vision by entrenching racial division, or perhaps a better word than to use would be elite privilege, betrays our Constitution's ideals. And remember, our Constitution even protects the right to free economic activity. Look at Section 22 of the Bill of Rights. It says that everyone in South Africa has a right to choose their trade or occupation or profession freely. But for that right to be meaningful, citizens must have real access to opportunities, real access to capital and skills. So then, with this vision in mind, we must ask ourselves, do our current economic policies align with these principles? Or do they perhaps fall short? Do they never fail to disappoint? Indeed, the jurisprudential test laid down in that case I mentioned, in the case of Minister of Justice versus Van Heerden, is not simply a suggestion by the Constitution. It is a binding, doctrinal framework within which all affirmative action must operate. The Constitutional Court really made it unequivocally clear, ladies and gentlemen, a measure cannot claim the protection of affirmative action in Section 9.2 of the Constitution unless it is reasonably capable of attaining its desired outcomes. It must be carefully designed to advance those disadvantaged by unfair discrimination, must not be merely a racial proxy to serve an elite class. It's also captured in subsidiary law that gives effect to Section 9 of the Constitution, the subsidiary law in this case being the Equality Act, which states that it is not unfair discrimination to take measures designed to protect or advance persons or categories of persons disadvantaged by unfair discrimination or the members of such groups or such persons. But if the remedial measures are arbitrary, if those remedial measures then become capricious, or if they display naked preference, then, ladies and gentlemen, they could hardly be said to be designed to achieve the constitutionally authorized end. It is sufficient, however, if the measure carries a reasonable likelihood of meeting that end. So importantly, in terms of that Van Heerden case, the measure cannot impose such substantial and undue harm on those excluded from its benefits that our long-term constitutional goal, again I mention the long-term constitutional goal of a non-racial, non-sexist society envisages. So I know we're talking about the Constitution, ladies and gentlemen. We would be remiss then not to mention Section 1 of the Constitution. And Section 1 of the Constitution lists non-racialism and non-sexism as its founding values, meaning that any measure then that fails to meet these three requirements that I've mentioned, that were set out in Van Heerden, will be merely unfair discrimination based on race. Again, something that's also prohibited then by the Equality Act. Any infringement on the rights to equality, on the rights to dignity, on the rights to occupational freedom as per Section 22 of the Constitution must pass a test laid down in Section 36 of the Constitution, the Limitations Clause. That is, that if there is an infringement on any one of these rights, it must show itself to be reasonable. It must show itself to be justifiable in an open and democratic society based on human dignity and equality and freedom. If it does not show that, then it fails the constitutional muster altogether. I put it to you then, prolonged reliance on race-based criteria in government policies that entrench permanent racial classification, that ignore economic nuance, and ultimately serve the few over the many, are not just flawed, ladies and gentlemen, these are unconstitutional. And this is because, one, they undermine that long-term vision, but secondly, that they fail to pass the Equality Act's fairness test because, one, they do not reasonably and justifiably differentiate between persons according to objective criteria intrinsic to the activity concerned. When tested under Section 14 of the Equality Act, the policies I mentioned falter, and falter horribly. They often impair dignity. They disproportionately impact poor black South Africans who feel the brunt of these policies perhaps more than anybody else. They reflect systematic patterns of exclusion and of elite capture, which have become common bywords in the South Africa of today. And yes, many of these policies have noble intentions and legitimate purposes. But while they have legitimate purposes, unfortunately we find that their design fails to achieve that purpose effectively and overlooks way less restrictive, way more equitable means of achieving that purpose. Aren't there a better way to do things? Perhaps the Germans could teach us a lesson on efficiency in this regard. Can't we target disadvantage based on socioeconomic status rather than just on race alone? Moreover, government has then not taken any reasonable steps to address the structural disadvantages of all affected groups. So when the actual test is then applied, these measures cannot be presumed fair and are indeed, as I mentioned, unconstitutional. Now, as we evaluate our policies, it then becomes clear that South Africa, as I said, has many well-intentioned policies, many well-intentioned transformation policies. But have we transformed ourselves for the better, or have we pointed these policies as a gun at our own feet? And I mention one notable law here, the Broad-Based Economic Empowerment Act of 2003, the BBBE Act, and also the Employment Equity Act of 1998. Let's look at these laws. Let's look at these laws. On paper, these aim to redress apartheid's legacy. And who wouldn't want to get behind that? But in practice, however, they often have become just tick box exercises. They have not been real engines of inclusion. Take BBBE. Its noble intention was to broaden black ownership and opportunity. Yet over time, all it's done was to devolve itself into a compliance checklist. Companies chase points for black ownership and procurement, but how much empowerment is actually happening on the ground? Even the BEE Commission itself, ironically, has cautioned against this tick box culture. And the result, as we all know, is that while some politically connected individuals become very wealthy indeed, the masses of disadvantaged South Africans have seen very little change. In fact, Professor William Gumede, you have concluded that BEE has led to increased poverty, has led to increased unemployment, has led to increased inequality. You've said that it's widened the very gap that it was meant to have bridged in the first place. Well-intentioned, ill-practiced. Put plainly, BEE may have hurt the black majority more than anyone. It creates that small, wealthy elite. It leaves the majority of people no better off than they were before 1994. There was a civil society group that I read about the other day who even noted that BEE has now become nothing more than elitist policy designed to protect connected interests at the expense of the unemployed majority. I think the key word really is there, at the expense of. We must not take that just as rhetorical jargon. At the expense of means that money that was supposed to have trickled down to the masses of poor people are now finding its way into the pockets of some politically connected individuals. And the consequences of this are absolutely dire, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, we've heard it before. But when we see the missed opportunities in reality, it becomes even more shocking. For example, onerous BEE rules now recently have even blocked the entry of Starlink into South Africa. Starlink is a satellite internet service that could have provided cheap broadband internet to rural areas. They could have provided digital skills to learners in schools. That could have stopped my Wi-Fi from lagging. But unfortunately, we are where we are. Professor Gumede, you've even estimated that R1 trillion, I had to read this again, R1 trillion in BEE deals has enriched fewer than 100 beneficiaries since 1994. That, ladies and gentlemen, is hardly broad broad-based empowerment. What is the broad base? How are they being empowered? We still see sky-high black poverty and youth unemployment despite decades of BE. This is a clear sign that yes, we've had the right goals, but we've had the wrong tools. And the same constitutional concerns arise with other areas of our policy. Take this 100 billion rands transformation fund. While it has positioned itself as a tool for economic inclusion, again, very well intentioned on paper, the fund itself builds on that same flawed foundation of BEE. It allocates benefits based primarily on race. That raises red flags under Section 1 of the Constitution, non-racialism, which I spoke about, also Section 9 of the Constitution, equality, particularly since BE has demonstrated its failed attempt to reduce inequality. Moreover, looking at this 100 billion rand transformation fund, its structure appears to completely bypass the National Revenue Fund, and that would be in violation of Section 213 of the Constitution. It ties public procurement to contributions. And then this breaches Section 217 of the Constitution, particularly because we completely then negate key elements like competitiveness and cost effectiveness. Those simply fly out of the window. And without express parliamentary approval, this transformation fund simply risks becoming a shadow budget, a parallel para-parliamentary process, vulnerable to elite capture, vulnerable to political misuse. Let me be clear, this is not transformation by constitutional design, this is redistribution by executive fiat. It is little more than a feeding trough. South Africa cannot afford another unaccountable fund that entrenches inequality while ignoring the principles of legality and transparency and outcome-based empowerment. The pattern continues. The story continues. The same pattern appears in other areas. Let's look at these. The employment equity regulations. They were meant to foster workplace diversity, noble in intent, ill-practiced. What has happened now is that these employment equity regulations have defaulted to rigid quotas without actually improving any skills or creating any jobs. For instance, you look at the Employment Equity Amendment Act of 2022, that introduces binding sectoral numerical targets across 18 sectors of society. They require companies with more than 50 employees to align their workforce demographics with national or regional racial profiles, or risk penalties including fines of up to 2.7 million rand or 10% of a company's annual turnover, or risk disqualification from getting any state tenders. This is a centralized approach. It's what's been hurting our economy for decades. And the centralized approach empowers the Minister of Employment and Labor to set these targets, yes, in consultation with other stakeholders. But one can then equally argue that all it does is effectively imposes racial quotas without addressing the underlying problems in society, the underlying inequalities in education, in training. It is an ill-conceived one-size-fits-all approach, and this one-size-fits-all approach risks hurting businesses and workers alike without truly empowering anybody in need. And while strong labor laws protect those with jobs, they've also made employers hesitant to hire any new employees. This is why we've seen recently that Mr. Johan Els, the chief economist at Old Mutual, he's warned us that South Africa will never reach the 5 to 6% GDP growth we need as long as our labor market remains so heavily overregulated. So you see, a law that inadvertently discourages hiring ends up hurting the very people it's meant to help, the unemployed. So ladies and gentlemen, I would be remiss not to mention that South Africa has what we euphemistically call a spending problem. A lot of our speakers have touched on this. Dr. Asher Sarupen has also mentioned this a number of times. We've got a spending problem in South Africa. How many of you remember recently the budget scandal? Not that one, the other one. There have been a number of budget scandals in South Africa. The truth is, our stagnant economic growth, now in the 0 point somethings, cannot be separated from how government spends our money. According to the Auditor General, over 38 billion rand was lost to fruitless and wasteful expenditure in 2023 and 24 alone. 38 billion rands lost, gone. That figure nearly cancels out the projected 42 billion rands that we would have gained from those controversial VAT increases. Do you see the link? VAT was increased, or supposed to have been increased, but we've got this spending problem. You fix the spending problem, you don't have to increase VAT, perhaps you could even give tax breaks. And this just proves that revenue shortfalls are not a function of low taxes, but of poor financial discipline in general. The Auditor General also warned that over 70% of audited departments fail to comply with basic financial controls, weakening service delivery and economic impact. How can we ever expect investors and entrepreneurs and job seekers to thrive in an environment where public funds simply vanish through mismanagement? If we are serious about economic growth, then yes, reform must begin with the government itself. Spending must be efficient, it must be transparent, it must be constitutional. Anything less undermines the rule of law that underpins our democracy and betrays the very people such budgets aim to serve. Meanwhile, we have an informal economy. We have the township economy, we've got Kazinomics. And those thrive outside of the formal legal framework. Millions of people rely on the informal sector for their very survival. Nearly 20% of all South Africans employed work in informal businesses. But our policies, ladies and gentlemen, our policies largely ignore, even inhibit the sector with burdensome bylaws. Our policies do not support those in the informal sector. Formalizing major players, formalizing the taxi industry could unlock jobs, could unlock revenue, could lead to safer infrastructure, and most importantly would broaden the tax base for SARS without ever considering raising taxes. So this informal market of ours is not a problem that we must view to be policed. It is an opportunity that must be cultivated. And failing to recognize and assist the informal sector means missing a huge chance for economic growth at the community level. So in short, yes, many of our current laws, from BEE to the labor laws we have, focus on form over substance. They measure inputs, they measure compliance, they do not measure real actual outcomes, and we must change that. Are these policies delivering real equality and inclusion, or are they just paperwork, nice to haves that sit on a shelf and empower a few at the expense of the many? I put it to you then that the evidence points only to the latter. To truly achieve an inclusive economy, we need to move beyond these tick box exercises and start moving the needle on poverty and unemployment and ownership for the many. But I was told I've got to come here and propose solutions, not just whine and complain, because I am young and young people need to be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. So how then, ladies and gentlemen, do we go about fixing these missteps created by those who came before us and better align our policies with the Constitution's vision? Well, we really must be bold and we have to be innovative in how we do this. So let's consider a few shifts in our thinking on what can be done. I think firstly, we must measure real outcomes and not just the paperwork I spoke of. I think it would be great if we create a transformation index or a scorecard really that rewards tangible results. How many jobs have been created? How many skills have been developed? How many businesses have been funded, rather than only looking at the percentage of black ownership in a specific company, in a specific economy. So for example, the way that we could do this is, if a company invests heavily in training young black engineers, if that same company hypothetically supports 50 new township entrepreneurs, then that should count for something. That should count more than just a token ownership deal. Ladies and gentlemen, empowerment must be about uplifting the people, not just transferring stakes on paper. But I think there are a lot of other things that we can do. Secondly, I think we should target socio-economic need. Many countries have done this, Singapore being one of them. Over time, we should shift criteria from race to class. Race was a proxy for the disadvantaged. Race was a proxy for the disadvantaged. But now, nearly 30 years on, we must refine our approach. The sun must set. An inclusive policy must prioritize poor rural communities, township youth, women entrepreneurs, those who have been most heavily marginalized over the last 30 years, who now today face the greatest barriers to inclusion. If we use these socioeconomic indicators, education, income, location, to guide us on crafting better policies, then we can surely ensure that help goes to those who actually need it, not elite capture, and would also uphold Section 9.2 of the Constitution's call to advance the disadvantaged without creating perpetual racial categorization. We speak about identity, and it seems to me that government itself is fixated on the idea of identity forming a part of our laws. Well, what about other socioeconomic indicators? What about education? What about location? I think these are incredibly important to recognize. Now, there are a number of things. Thirdly, we must then promote broad-based ownership in enterprise. Now, I'm not talking about BEE, so instead of forcing companies into narrow BEE ownership deals, let's allow more flexibility to the policies via empowerment mechanisms like equity equivalence. We've all heard the word equity equivalent over the last few months when the Starlink issue was being debated in the media. Equity equivalent is an existing program. I wish Starlink were an existing program. Equity equivalent is an existing program that lets firms invest in community development or small black-owned businesses in lieu of handing over equity. What this means, what the equity equivalent program refers to, is that instead of asking a company to give away a chunk of its business operations, let's ask that same company to invest that same amount of money in the very community in which it operates. And this results then in tangible empowerment for those in that locality. So we should expand these alternatives. And there are a number of other alternatives. Let's, for instance, look at something called employee share ownership plans that gives workers in a company a direct stake in their company, and that spreads wealth through ordinary workers in their company and truly broadens ownership. So we can also explore enterprise zones in disadvantaged areas by offering tax breaks and more streamlined, less red tape heavy rules for businesses that set up and hire locally. Let's reward those who are doing well. Why punish the few who are doing well? And these ideas have been proven elsewhere, and they can unlock growth in communities that need it the most. And we may even venture so far as to say that we need a completely bold reset, like establishing something in terms of an opportunity fund that would finance education and new enterprises for the poor, or for adopting a non-racial economic empowerment policy that focuses purely on economic disadvantage and merit. All of these that I've mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, all of these alternatives, these proposals, aim to achieve equity by uplifting the underprivileged of all races, rather than just enforcing new perpetual racial quotas. And we must also, I would also be remiss not to say that we must pursue smarter labor laws. We can protect workers and encourage hiring at the same time. Yes, we can do it, protect workers and encourage hiring at the same time. The law should make it easier for firms to take a chance on inexperienced job seekers. For example, we've got to simplify our dismissal procedures for probationary employees. We've got to exempt very small businesses from certain onerous regulations. All of these could stimulate job creation without undermining the core labor rights that underpin our democracy. The Constitution's guarantee of fair labor practices does not demand red tape that stifles jobs. That balance can be struck. We can strike a balance between worker dignity while reducing the fear that employers have of expanding their workforce. Every one of these shifts that I've mentioned moves us closer to equality, to substantive equality. In each case, we focus on capacity building and opportunity in line with the Constitution's vision, rather than mere token compliance on paper. And the end goal is a healthy, inclusive economy where redress is still achieved, but achieved through growth and empowerment, not through zero-sum redistribution among just a few. And by realigning our policies now, we can ensure that today's corrective measures lay the foundations for tomorrow's truly non-racial and prosperous society. But ladies and gentlemen, finally, to achieve an inclusive economy, there has to be a reset. There has to be a new partnership between government, business, and community. A new partnership between government, business, and community. The public sector must create an environment where the private sector can thrive and invest. Why? Because it is the private sector that has the capital, it is the private sector that has the expertise, it is the private sector that has the networks to create jobs at scale. We must also confront hard truths. At present, the bulk of government revenue is eaten up by something we've mentioned this morning. The bulk of government revenue is eaten up by the public sector wage bill. Christo, you mentioned 700 or 800 billion rand. The question then we must ask ourselves is, where is the return on investment? When we have children in school, 80% of which in grade 4 cannot read for meaning, where is the return on investment? Our public sector wage leaves too little room for economic development, and this must change only through discipline and reform. And for this, policy certainty becomes crucial. If we have rules that keep changing, if we have rules like mining charters or licensing requirements that keep changing or keep becoming too onerous, the answer is simple: investors will simply take their money elsewhere. We must send a clear message that South Africa is open for business for all and welcomes all who can come in and help grow our economy. Government's role is to provide policy certainty and infrastructure and to spend public resources efficiently on services that enable economic growth, on education, on healthcare, on security. Business's role, on the other hand, is to invest and to expand here at home, to train workers, to innovate, to build industries. And moreover, we should seize these opportunities in emerging sectors. We must not discount the fact that there are emerging sectors that if we do not look at now, will bypass us. The renewable energy sector, digital services, agro-processing. This is where South Africa can create jobs. By encouraging investment and skill development in these high-growth industries, we can leapfrog constraints and generate inclusive growth for the 21st century. And therefore, we should incentivize enterprises through sensible measures. Cut the unnecessary red tape. Streamline permits. Offer tax breaks for those who build factories for call centers in high unemployment areas. Rather than government and business being at odds, they must work hand in hand. When a company grows and hires, South Africa wins. When government ensures a rule of law and a skilled workforce is in place, business wins. It is a mutual dependence that we must cultivate, and it is heartening then in that regard to see the work of Operation Vulindlela. But disheartening to note that South Africa has a youth bulge. Every year, hundreds of thousands of school leavers and graduates join the labor market. We need to make sure that they find opportunities here at home. This is the last frontier. There must not be greener pastures anywhere else. Our youth must not languish in unemployment or leave South Africa to set up home abroad. Crucially, we must give young South Africans a stake in this partnership. Government, business, consumers. Youth are not just beneficiaries. They are the innovators and the entrepreneurs of our economy. Let's support youth-led startups. Let's expand entrepreneurships. And let's give out learnerships to make it easier for first-time job seekers to get that initial experience. Remember, investing in our youth is investing in our country's future. This spirit of partnership with government as the enabler, with business as the driver, with citizens as active participants is how we will generate the inclusive growth that we want. And this is why I'm so happy also to note that the FW de Klerk Foundation has been making great strides in going down to young people to inform them about the Constitution. Because we believe that growth begins with the Constitution, understanding your rights and building on that. Indeed, the Constitution for the FW de Klerk Foundation is the foundation for the youth to live a better life in South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, we now stand at a crossroads. We can either cling to failing formulas and watch our dream deferred, or we can embrace these bold reforms that I've mentioned, that our Constitution envisages, and I'm confident that we will choose the latter. Why? Because everywhere I look, I see South Africans determined to turn promises into reality. Lastly, if we were to close our eyes and imagine the South Africa we strive for, how would that look like? We would have an inclusive economy where every child in a rural village or in a township has the same chance to prosper as a child in any suburb, where your hard work and talents carry you, not your skin color, not your family connections, where every person who wants to work or who wants to start a business finds doors that are open, doesn't find walls. That would be a nation that lives up to the spirit of the Constitution. I leave you with this last thought in one word: there is hope. Despite our challenges, many of them as they may be, I have hope. Hope that our youth will see a brighter future in this land. Hope that we will unite across all divides to build a sustainable and prosperous future for all. I know we have the principles. I know we have the people. I know we all have the passion to build an inclusive economy. Let us go forward from here and make it happen. Together, we must surely succeed. Thank you.